All right, we're going to move now from Europe to, we're going to head east into Eastern Europe and Russia, moving east to the continent of Asia. I wanted to start with this slide, which is something interesting I learned from the text, actually. The pre Christian foundation of Russia had a lot to do, and it's going to lead right into the first bit of architecture that we're going to look at here. But the history of Russia traces itself to something that was in abundance around the time that we're leaving the Renaissance. The 14th and 15th century is about the time that we're going to be, well, we're going to cover a period of from about 1000 to 1500 in Russia in this lecture. But in that time period, as well as in the current time period, Russia is a very fertile land. There are lots of forests. There's a lot of lush landscape. And with forest and with an abundance of trees comes a more prominent usage of wood and lumber in their architecture, which is a little bit of a contrast from what you've been seeing so far. You've been seeing a high incidence of use of masonry and stone and even concrete. And we're going to start seeing a little bit of a change in materiality in the work that we look at today in Eastern Europe and in Western Russia with the use of wood. So let me start with this slide. So this is, as I mentioned, something I learned from the text because of its rich history of honoring trees and forests. Apparently, what was tradition and is still tradition today in Russia as well as in the Nordic countries, and this is even a tradition that you see being practiced even in the West. I've seen photographs of construction sites in Canada and the United States where you'll see a tree erected at the very top of the structure. Well, the story is that the tree, because the forests brought both good things and bad in the lore of Russian history, the practice was seen as a way of kind of bringing the good spirits by respecting the nature that gave way to the ability to build these buildings, as well as to drive away the bad spirits, for lack of a better term. So, an interesting cultural practice that actually says a lot about construction material that is going to get used a lot. Okay, one of the vocabulary terms that's already on your chapter 10 term sheet, it was even on the term sheet for the Renaissance exam, is lukovica. And lukovica means onion-shaped dome. Let me give you the proper, the lukovica dome is basically the dome in the shape of an onion. In the Russian architectural vocabulary, there are basically 4 subtypes of the lukovica, and we're going to look quickly here at all 4 of them, just so you have a kind of a broad overview and a sort of a visual cue as to what the general typology is, and then we'll look more specifically at some of the highlight architectural works. So first, so obviously we're talking about the dome that sits on top of the tholobate. The tholobate is important in identifying lukovica because, as you'll see in subsequent examples, the onion-shaped dome concept, one of its giveaways is that if it has a diameter that's wider than the tholobate that it sits on, then that's one of the characteristic features that makes it distinctly a lukovica dome. But one of the types is this type, which is the helmet-shaped dome. Here's another example of it. It's not too dissimilar to the domes that we've been looking at thus far in the Renaissance, with the one exception being that as the dome makes its way towards the tholobate, there's a little bit of what you'll remember is from Alberti's, the S-curved volutes. There's a little bit of a kind of a spline curve or an S-curve at the very end as it sort of projects out to meet the outer rim of the Lukovica. So that's the first one, which is a pear-shaped. The helmet Lukovica dome. This, which we're going to look at more specifically as sort of starting point of Russian architecture, it has at the top of it a really good example of the pear-shaped, what we call the pear-shaped Lukovica dome. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the distinguishing characteristics is that it has a diameter that is wider than the tholobate that it sits upon. That's kind of the dead giveaway that it's a pear-shaped Lukovica dome. There's another view of it. This is actually the oldest extant building in all of Russia. It's the oldest standing building that is still there today, and it dates back from the 10th century. Actually, we'll get into it here in a second. So that's the helmet dome, the pear-shaped dome. There is the Baroque bud dome, as the book refers to it. It's the Baroque bud dome, and this is actually at St. Andrews in Kiev, in Ukraine. And its distinguishing characteristic is the adornment or the decoration upon the dome. So it's basically very similar to this dome, although it has a decoration that's been applied to it. Is a sort of distinguishing characteristic, and that'll make a little bit more sense too when we get to the Baroque, when you see that the Baroque is all about kind of overstimulation and excess use of symbol and icon and graphic and art. So there's the Baroque bud dome. And then there's finally what's called the mixture, and this is St. Sophia at Novgorod, and it's basically a combination of all four. It has the helmet shape where you can see at the very top if you were to draw a section of it, and I should figure out if I can start sketching on screen here, where the helmet dome basically comes down and has just a subtle kind of curvature towards the outside as it meets the tholobate. This one basically does that curvature, but then flushes up. Actually, it stretches out even wider than the tholobate and sort of the fingers sort of extend down over the top of it. But it also has characteristics from the Baroque bud dome in that, first of all, it's gilded in gold or copper. And then you can see the sort of patterning on it, and then the cross that sits on top. I would say it doesn't have the characteristic of the onion-shaped dome, because if you look carefully, at no point does this dome have a diameter that's actually wider than the tholobate. But still, it mixes together three different characteristic elements. And thereby the book refers to this dome at St. Sophia as basically having a mixture of the Russian dome types. Okay, the use of the Lukovica really became prominent in about the middle of the 16th century. And its use increased really as a patriotic gesture to celebrate what was a very important milestone in the Russian Empire, which was Ivan IV's or Ivan the Terrible's victory over Kazan. Kazan is a region that I don't know who controlled the area. It may have been a carryover from Genghis Khan and the Khan dynasty, so it may have been under the control of China. But it's sort of central West Russia, and Ivan the Fourth, and it was territory that was really never in the hands of what we know today as the Russian Federation. Ivan the Fourth was able to conquer that land after multiple efforts. Was finally able to successfully conquer that land, and this was a big moment for the Russian Empire in that they weren't an empire yet, but the Russian peoples, and the dome, the architectural feature of the Lukovica became sort of synonymous with celebrating Russian patriotism. Really became synonymous with patriotism. So it came more into prominent use after Ivan IV's victory over Kazan, and it became kind of an advertisement, a marker. And we'll see when we really finish at the Kremlin today in Moscow, how it's basically used as really as a political victory symbol is the phrase that I'm looking for. Okay, so Saint Sophia. There's a lot of Saint Sophias. We're going to look at 3 or 4 Saint Sophias today. Saint Sophia in Kiev, or Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, or Hagia Sophia, depending on how you read it or how you understand it. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul is Saint Sophia. Saint Sophia is Hagia Sophia, and really what it means is holy wisdom. So it's really one of the first instances where a church is not being named after a saint or an apostle or somebody from Jesus's orbit in the Bible. Rather, it's been given this name of holy wisdom that doesn't necessarily associate with a character from history, from Christian history, I should say. And so there's a lot of St. Sophias. We're going to look at, like I said, 3 or 4 of them today. And this is one of them, St. Sophia in Kiev, built in 1025 originally. And a lot of what you see in the brickwork here, which I'm going to call attention to and give you another vocabulary term here in a minute. But a lot of that is the original construction from 1025, and then the building really gained cathedral status when it was rebuilt from the 14th through the 17th century. So 14C through 17C. And you can see there's, I believe there are 13 domes on this church, and the 13 domes are symbolic in that they represent the one grand dome, which is, you can see here in the center of your screen, clad in gold, is said to represent Jesus. And the 12 domes surrounding that central dome are said to represent the 12 apostles. So together, they basically are telling the story of Jesus. The vocabulary term that I want to call your attention to is really one of the first examples that we see of new being wrapped around existing, but not necessarily hiding. We saw Alberti. We saw Alberti at Mantua, at San Sebastian, where he's taking an existing San Sebastian, Mantua, and also at Malatestiano, the Tempio Malatestiano, where he's taking an existing historic basilica or Gothic church and he's wrapping new around it. And really from the outside, unless you know the story and you have the insight that we have, that we're learning in this class and from the book, you really don't, it's not so obvious to the untrained eye that there's something from 500 years before underneath the wrapper of the outside. Basically, Alberti does a really good job of making it look as though his architecture is the only architecture that exists, and it's not necessarily enveloping something old. Okay. Well, here at Santa Sofia or Saint Sophia, what the architects are doing is they're basically showing off some of the existing and the historic, and they're cladding the new over the top of it, but they're exercising, a little bit of restraint, a little bit of kind of framing these existing masonry elements that have kind of Romanesque characteristic. And this style, this method of covering but revealing parts of is referred to as opus mixtum. Opusmixtum, which is basically the style of mixing. And in this case, you're looking at brick and stone, and you're looking at the plaster that's basically clad over the rest of the facade. But in selective areas, the architects are using opus mixtum to show you the story that this is basically a new foundation being put on something existing that is historic from before. So opus mixtum, that's the second vocabulary term after Lukovica. This is also a hypostyle mosque. Here's another really, really good view of the primary facade. This is actually the rear facade. This is the rear apse we're looking at. If you remember back from the vocabulary we learned in the Renaissance lectures. This is I'll come back to the interiors. This is a hypostyle mosque plan. And in the prehistory architectural history class that I teach, which is before the Renaissance, we learn about the Egyptian and the use of the hypostyle hall, which is basically these grand columns that really define the space, and there's less room in between the columns, and more mass is taken up, or more surface area is taken up by the columns. Basically, it's a field of thick, wide columns that take up 80% of the floor area, and the 20% of the floor area that remains is basically the spaces that you can move in and around, which is a little bit different from how we use a column today, in that a column is generally thinner. It might be 12 inches, 24 inches, 36 inches, but it's the sort of thin element within a larger space. The hypostyle hall is basically an inversion of that. And so the St. Sophia church plan is thought of as being a hypostyle church plan, in that you can see there's a pretty generous distribution of solid to void, more so black to white than what we're accustomed to seeing. If you just kind of took a snapshot of this and did a kind of a percentage study, you'd probably find, 35% solid and 65% void. Whereas if you were to look at a more modern, when I say modern, a 15th, 16th, 17th century church plan, which uses just kind of circular columns and not these grand cruciform hypostyle columns, you'd probably have a distribution of solid to void of about 20 to 80% or so. So hypostyle plan. Okay, so from Saint Sophia, actually we're going to move to Moscow now, which what we're looking at is an aerial photograph of the Kremlin. And the Kremlin equals walled city. The definition of Kremlin means a walled city, a fortified city. Let's see. Let me back up here a second. Oh, okay. I skipped over that's what confused me. I skipped over the Church of the Lazarus. So yes, hypostyle, or the Lukovica dome characteristic, but the church is named Church of Saint Lazarus. Lazarus, Lazarus, built in the 14th century. The oldest oldest extant church yeah, the oldest standing church in Russia today. Part of the reason it was preserved is because it was actually encased or encapsulated by a 17th century church that was built later and that basically protected it over the times and the many wars and tumultuous times that that part of the world has seen. Um, Alas, it is with us today, and it's a good example of the way in which Russian architecture began, which is through the use of wood construction, which was the most prominent material available then and still today. Although they build a lot less with wood, that's kind of how they got their start. The method of construction that you're seeing here is probably not unsimilar to what you see in different parts of the United States. You guys are probably all familiar with the notion of the log cabin. Well, what's used here is basically block work, which is taking pieces of timber that have been cut from tree trunks, obviously, and stacked 90 degrees towards one another with basically the routing being done in one log with another perpendicular log laid into that routed portion that thereby gives the corner its stability. And as you kind of work your way around, the four members together work kind of like a collar in that they reinforce one another. And by stacking, you have heavy masses, so you have a pretty stable load that's supported by the subsequent layers. The layer below is supporting the layer above. So you don't need necessarily any notion of trabeated structure here. And also, it has a fairly decent insulating value because you're actually building a pretty thick wall. Now, obviously, you have holes and gaps in between, air and cold air and hot air, depending on whether it's summer or winter, certainly seep through. But there are ways to address that as well by kind of insulating on the inside. Another characteristic that you're going to start to see as we kind of work our way around the continent, either the European or the Asian continent, before we land back in Europe, you see a high pitch roof. And you see a high pitch roof because Russian winters are cold and snowy winters. There's a lot of snow in this part of the world. And so a roof that has a lower pitch is going to withhold snow, thereby creating a heavier load, thereby creating a risk of collapse. And so the higher pitch roofs, which you see a lot more of also in the Scandinavian countries, is basically another characteristic that we like to refer to as indigenous. It's part of the indigenous architecture. Climate drives the form because it comes out of necessity and function. Without such a high pitch roof, you wouldn't be able to support the loads that would come with a lower pitch roof that ends up collecting a lot more snow and thereby risking collapse, obviously. We talked about the dome. We've talked about the tholobate. We talked about the block work. I think that's it on St. Lazarus. Okay, and then the second bit before we get to Moscow and the Kremlin that I had skipped over that I wanted to step back on is after the victory over Kazan, there's another kind of a key moment in Russian history where the Tatars invade Russia and really overtake all of Russia with the exception of one area called Novograd. And the reason why Novograd wasn't overtaken and remained as the one kind of bastion for the um, Russian country was because it was protected by swamps and heavy, dense forests. By 1480, Ivan the Terrible comes back around and is able to expel the Tatars from really all the rest of the country. And it's not until Ivan's victory and success in purging the Tatars out of this part of the world that he decides to basically create the city of Moscow, or establish Moscow as the new capital of the country. And really, what he's trying to do, and this is very important architecturally, or in Russia's architectural history, is what he's trying to do when he sets out to create Moscow is to create what he refers to as, quote, a third Rome. Okay, so there's Rome, there's Constantinople, which is perceived as being a second Rome. You know, the Holy Roman Empire essentially was split into two. You had Rome as the primary seat of the Western Roman Empire, and you had Constantinople as the seat of really the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, if you will. And so we know that as kind of a world history, and these kings and czars and emperors certainly are well aware of kind of world events. And so they know they're of Rome, they know of Constantinople. And when Ivan sets out to really create this new thing, this new center of Moscow, he does it with the intent that he's creating a third Rome for the Russian people. Okay, so we're going to look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to look at these 5 buildings, and I'll do them in, I think, the order that we're going to look at them. The Cathedral of the Dormition. So these are all, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which we're not going to look at Ivan's bell tower. We'll see it in the background of some of the images. But basically, these 5 prominent buildings, as well as other government buildings that are in prominent use today, really all happen within the walls of the Kremlin. And the one very famous building that I'm sure all of you have seen and will recognize right away, the Cathedral of St. Basil, actually happens, ironically enough, outside of the walled city of the Kremlin. So the one thing that we see pictures of, that we see associated with Russia as being, quote, the Kremlin, is actually not the Kremlin at all. It's the Cathedral at St. Basil, and it's actually outside of the fortified walls, which is what the Kremlin actually is the fortification, or the walls. So what we're going to look at is the Cathedral of the Annunciation. I'm sorry, I'll go in order here. Cathedral of the Dormition, Cathedral of the Archangel Michael, the Cathedral of the Annunciation, and the Faceted Palace. And actually, the one thing I've left out so far that I do want to touch on is you are seeing a little bit of influence from the West, from Italy and Rome. Obviously, we've been studying for the past 2 or 3 weeks this kind of powerful movement that started, which is the Renaissance. There's no question that the Russians are aware of what's happening in the Renaissance. There's certainly travel to and fro. There's trade. There's diplomacy, etc. So people in this part of the world are aware of what's happening in that part of the world. And certainly some of it is making its way into our architecture here in Russia. But at the same time, the Russians also want to kind of plant their own flag of having architectural identity. So you're going to see over the next few slides a little bit of a kind of a struggle to create their own identity um, with their own ideas, with their own symbols, with their own colors, with their own forms, etc. Okay, so and then here's an aerial photograph. So we're going to look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the Kremlin walls. Okay, so the first one is the Cathedral of Dormition within the walls of the Kremlin. And this is actually designed by a fellow architect by the name of Aristotle Fioravanti. Aristotle Fioravanti, built in the 1470s. We can see here a few characteristics that are familiar to us from the past few weeks of study. First of all, we have the traditional arched opening. Very common. We saw this a lot in the work that we looked at in Florence. We saw this in Rome, in different parts of Italy that we've studied to date. That's not an uncommon thing to us already. We have what looks like maybe either a biforum window or windows that are basically defined by offset pilasters. Still kind of elements that are coming from vocabulary of what's happening in the West. And certainly the masonry work gives it a Romanesque characteristic and a quality that's undeniably referencing Renaissance architecture or the architecture of the West. Now, the way it's capped and the way we're terminating the top of it here in this work, as well as clearly the Lukovica that has for certain a diameter that's wider than Tholobate and has kind of a unique adorning pattern around the rim of the dome, is unique, is something that we haven't seen before or to date in this class. So there's this sort of identifying itself as something new, as something different, but there's also borrowed elements from what's happening in other parts of the world. So this is the Cathedral at Dormition, Aristotle Fioravantini, 1470s. Let's see. Oh, and if I didn't make the note, Ivan means Tsar, which means Caesar. So even the terminology of the leadership is kind of a terminology that's being borrowed from the West. Okay, it's Cathedral of the Dormition. Even the use of black is something unique to us. I see some kind of experimentation or some wanting to kind of create something new. And also, this is interesting here in the what is basically the side aisle. So there's domes put on the side aisle, which is a unique thing in and of itself. This is an apse off of the side aisle, which is not a common place we would have seen an apse. We would have seen an apse more commonly on the rear or radially around the rear element of the basilica or the cruciform plan. So it's not every day that we're seeing an apse here off of the side aisle. That's unique. But also what I wanted to point out is at the top of the three bays beneath the dormer roofs that extend off of the roof line here, you're seeing fresco applied on the outside of a building for one of the first times. And actually the same thing is done over the entry. So there's certainly some unique things that are coming out of the architects working in Russia at the time. The dome being probably the most prominent one, use of gold, use of copper, and certainly some kind of expressive things happening with respect to an apse that actually has pilasters at what might be the faceted ends of a hexagon or at the corners of a hexagon. So there's certainly some unique things happening here. And here's a view on the inside, kind of almost an overstimulation use of art. Really, every surface is adorned with art here at Dormition. Okay, from Dormition, we're going to move to the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael. We see what I would describe as a little bit of a refinement and an advancement on what we saw at Dormition. You still have the Lukovica domes, clearly, but the masonry work or the brickwork is not so evident. Only when you look real close at the base of the building, you'll see the construction revealed to you that, okay, this is a building built out of masonry blocks, but has been covered in a white plaster finish. So the white plaster finish, I would say, does a couple of things. First of all, it gives the building a little bit more of a polish and less of kind of a rusticated presence. But also the use of the smoothness here on the facade and the texture, I think, highlights the color and the material used on the dome. It really draws more attention to, because it's this kind of high incidence, high intensity of gold, really almost set against a white sheet of paper. So there's contrast, I would say, being used effectively here at the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael. Okay, the faceted palace. So this is interesting because it's built really to give a sense of familiarity. Well, first of all, I should say it's built not as a religious, not an ecclesiastical building. It's built as what would be an American equivalent? It's built as a hall to be used by the government, but for formal, non-religious, non-governmental affairs. Could be used for diplomatic occasions. Could be used for a ball. Could be used for premiere of a new play or a performance or theater. But really, it's not so much the program that's relevant here. It's the architecture and the facade specifically of the architecture, which is built deliberately in a European style so that the building has it appeals to the Russia's European guests. So it's this way of the Tsar building a building that brings a sense of home and comfort to diplomatic visitors to his palace compound. Used for diplomatic affairs, intended to be familiar to European guests. With the architects, by the way, were also imported from Italy to build this building. Marco Ruffo and Pietro Solari, two Italian architects, and use of the foliated columns, which you can see adorning the windows on either side, and the diamond-shaped revetments, which basically gives the look. I mean, you probably are thinking a little bit of Palazzo Rucellai, or Palazzo Medici Riccardi, with the sort of rusticated base of the tripartite building. And that's deliberate. That's the intent here. I'm sorry. This was not the Cathedral of Archangel Michael. It was the Cathedral of the Annunciation. This is the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael. Lamberti de Montagna, the architect. And this is described as the book describes this as the most Italian-looking church at the Kremlin. And we can certainly see some similarities. The deep niches around the tall arched window openings, the sort of clear reading of the alignment of the bays from top to bottom. Even the tholobates look a little bit more European or Renaissance than what we saw here. And the material, the beige masonry, the sort of restraint used to not put a high amount of color or even metallic cladding here at this building is probably the 3 or 4 things that make this what the book refers to as the most Italian-looking church at the Kremlin. Okay, and finally, the cathedral at St. Basil. So some work of architecture that probably is quite familiar to you. We see this image used a lot when the news talks about Russia or talks about the Kremlin. Again, this is the Cathedral of St. Basil, which is just outside of the Kremlin, but generally is kind of forms part and parcel with the buildings inside the Kremlin. It's on the Red Square. Was built 1552 through 1561, so over a 9-year period, which is a long time for construction. But it's actually quite quick relative to some of the work that we just finished studying in early Renaissance, which sometimes took 40, 50, 60 years or more to build. And so this was built for Ivan IV, again, celebrating the victory over the Tatars. This building here in the center was actually the first building, and it wasn't the Cathedral of St. Basil. The entire thing is considered the Cathedral of St. Basil, but really it was a development that was built around the 14th century Church of the Trinity. So in the center, you're seeing the original construction and then really the additions around it that make up the this work that we were looking at on the prior slide and you're looking at on this slide. The most distinguishing characteristic of the Cathedral of St. Basil is something we all know, but we may not have the vocabulary for it yet. But I'm going to give you the term, which is really your third and final term from this lecture, which are the variegated cupolas. So the cupolas are basically the lukovicas, or the domes at the very top, and each of them has a variegated, meaning it is ever changing. For example, this one here, kind of right of center, has a zigzag pattern and is white, red, white, red, white, red, white. So it is constantly changing. It's not one color or one tone or one material all the way up. Its form is changing, certainly as you move up or as you move down, but also the materiality and the color and even the pattern is changing, which together comprises the notion variegated, variegated, but it's happening at the cupola, so these are referred to as variegated cupolas. Variegated cupola, cupolas. The building is built on really a 9 square grid idea, and I'll hold on that, and I'll give you more when we get into the late Renaissance on what the 9 square grid is. Really just magnificent work. It's hard not to admire the level of detail, the intricacy, what looks like just some amazing craftsmanship too that has gone into the relief on the walls as you move to the tholobate, and then even the variegated cupolas that we just talked about. There is one kind of last interesting thing I wanted to share about the Cathedral of St. Basil, which again gives the architecture really nationalistic or cultural pride, which is that each of the domes was built after an important victory during the battles, multiple battles against the Tatars. So each dome was built basically to mark a different milestone, a different major battle victory in this longer effort to expel these foreign people from what is perceived to be their native lands, their historic and rightful lands. So really each dome kind of marks a tick along the way of purging and cleaning out enemy from the territory of Russia. So there's even further significance to what each of these domes has come to represent, or was built really to represent. Oh, and the use of wood is actually a very important point that ties back to one of the first slides that we looked at in today's lecture. And I'm at 47 minutes, so it's good. I want to try to keep it to 50 minutes. The use of wood is a very important and deliberate reference to really where the architecture of Russia started, with use of wood construction. So that's another reference to sort of their cultural history. I mean, I guess the last thing I'd point out here is just the scale of this thing. I mean, if you look here in the foreground, I mean, these are people obviously moving about. So at 5 feet, I mean, just the scale of even just the foreground piece is amazing. Okay, that's my last slide for the day, and that's basically a tour through kind of Ukraine, Russia, and we're gonna continue moving eastward into China with the next lecture. Oh, and fantastic job on the exams. I've graded them all, other than I think one that was submitted late because of a very important medical reason. But I was very impressed. I was very impressed with all of the essay, the exam responses. Best set of first exams I've seen since I've been teaching this class. So I was truly impressed, and I appreciate the effort you all put forward. I tried to give you all critical feedback so that you can improve on the already good results that you turned in on this first exam. So look for those. If you have any questions, let me know. And you can take it easy for a week or two, because I don't think your next essay is going to be due for another, I think, week and a half. But I'll post in the next lecture, I'll post more specific instructions on the next essay and the next exam. So good job, everyone, on the exam. Thank you for paying attention here for this lecture on Russian architecture. And I'll post within a couple days on, we're going to move into the architecture of China. Thank you.